You didn't lose years. You spent years believing you had lost. And that distinction seems small until you realize that it is precisely there, in that interpretation, that all destruction happens. There is a collective illusion, silent and devastatingly effective, that life follows a straight line, that there is a right time for everything, that there are windows, milestones, age limits, that if you haven't built by a certain date, haven't found the right partner before 35, haven't founded the company before 40, then you are late. And worse than being late, you are someone who has wasted what was most valuable, your time. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who spent more than 50 years observing the human psyche with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a geologist, reached a conclusion that most people will never have the courage to accept. The most persistent suffering in adult life does not come from what happened. It comes from the meaning you attributed to what happened. And as long as that meaning remains intact, no future achievement will be able to eliminate the feeling that something was left behind. This is the starting point, not a promise that everything will get better, not an encouraging message wrapped in pretty metaphors, a precise diagnosis of the mechanism that makes people suffer, not for what they lived, but for the narrative they build around what they lived. Because suffering most of the time is not born from the event itself. It is born from the story you tell yourself about that event. A breakup doesn't destroy a life. The story you internally repeat about that breakup, that it was too late, that you didn't deserve it, that you lost the only chance to be happy, that is what destroys. A period of professional stagnation does not annihilate a career. The belief that this period proves you are not good enough, that others advanced while you stood still, that the train left without you, it is that belief that permanently installs poison in the way you make every subsequent decision. Jung called this a complex. Not in the popular flippant sense we use the word. A complex in the technical Jungian sense is a psychic knot, a set of emotions, memories, and beliefs that organize themselves around a central wound and come to function as a distorting lens. Once installed, this complex does not ask permission. It simply operates. It colors the way you interpret a criticism at work. It distorts the way you read the silence of someone you love. It transforms a simple delay into confirmation of a theory you have carried about yourself for years, that you are the one who always arrives late, that the best life has to offer has already been given to others. And what Jung found most disturbing is that no amount of conscious effort undoes this knot while it remains unconscious. You can work 18 hours a day trying to compensate for the years you believe you lost. You can chase after certifications, achievements, relationships, bank numbers. But if the complex remains active, each achievement will be immediately devalued by the same mechanism that installed the wound. You arrive, look at what you built, and feel it is not enough. Not because it isn't, but because the wound does not accept external evidence as healing. The restoration begins, and Jung was very precise about this, when you change the meaning assigned to lived experiences. Not the event, the meaning. Because you cannot alter what happened. You cannot bring back the marriage that ended, the years spent in wrong jobs, the relationships left unfinished, the opportunities you didn't recognize when they stood before you. But you have absolute control over the significance those events carry in the architecture of your life. And it is precisely this shift in meaning that separates those who build something extraordinary in the second half of life from those who remain forever imprisoned in a first half they can no longer touch. What you call wasted years were, in reality, the only possible path toward the kind of person you needed to become. The difficulty with this statement is not intellectual, it is emotional, because accepting it requires letting go of grief for a parallel version of yourself that never existed. The one who didn't make the mistakes, who didn't lose the time, who arrived sooner. And as long as you mourn that fantasy, the real version of you, built with precision by exactly what you lived, remains underutilized. But here is where most people make the second mistake. They hear this, take a deep breath and think, all right, then now I'll run faster. I'll make up for lost time. I'll be more disciplined, more focused, more efficient. And the effort resumes. The frantic, urgent, guilty effort, as if speed could replace what only time can build, as if the amount of effort expended could hasten a process that, by nature, has its own rhythm. There is a radical difference between effort and maturation. Effort is what you apply to the material. Maturation is what happens inside the material, regardless of what you do. A wine does not age faster because you shake it more often. Wood does not gain density by being subjected to more heat in less time. A diamond is not formed by applying more pressure faster. It forms when the right pressure meets the necessary time. And a human psyche does not develop genuine wisdom, real emotional balance, functional patience, or solid inner strength simply because the individual has accelerated the pace of their external activities. Jung observed this in his patients repeatedly over decades. Highly functional, highly productive men and women who had built impressive careers, amassed concrete achievements, built seemingly stable families, and yet arrived at the consulting room with the feeling that they were hollow inside. Not because they hadn't worked hard enough, but because they had never stopped long enough for experiences to convert into understanding, for pain to convert into wisdom, for error to convert into real calibration of the internal navigation system. There is a process that Jung called individuation, the progressive movement of the psyche toward its own totality, toward what he called the self, the organizing center of the personality that includes both the conscious and the unconscious. This process has a rhythm, not the rhythm of the market, not the rhythm of social media, not the rhythm of family expectations, the rhythm of the psyche. And what people call unproductive years, phases of stagnation, dead periods, are very often the years when this process is most active in the deep layers. They are the periods when on the surface nothing seems to be happening. But in the innermost structures of the personality, something is being forged with a precision that no conscious effort could replicate. Genuine patience is not a virtue you decide to have. It is a quality that settles into you after life has done something with which you could do absolutely nothing except endure. Real emotional maturity is not a choice. It is the result of having been wrong in ways painful enough that being wrong no longer seems like an attractive option. Inner balance is not born from readings, practices, or techniques. It is born from having been completely unbalanced so many times, in so many different ways, that the nervous system finally learns, at the deepest level, below language, below rationalization, what is and what is not a real threat. These qualities, maturity, patience, balance, inner strength, are what turn achievements into a legacy. They are what make someone who starts seemingly late go further than someone who started early without them. Because without them, speed does not build, speed destroys. The individual who runs fast without sufficient psychic structure arrives at the destination and discovers that the destination was not what they thought. And then they have to start over, this time older, more exhausted, and with fewer emotional resources for the rebuilding. It is not that you stood still during those years. It is that what was being built in you had no visible form. It did not produce measurable outputs. It did not show up on any report. But it was happening with the same inexorability with which a tree root grows in the dark, unseen by anyone, with no external effort accelerating the process, preparing the structure that will sustain decades of visible growth. The question is not why it took so long. The question is, what do you do now with what you have become during all that time? That is why I prepared the Código de Despertar for you, not as another productivity system, not as a list of habits wrapped in psychology, but as a 60-day map built on the structure of Jungian psychology so that you may understand, in a concrete and applicable way, what was built in you during the years you classified as lost, and how to use that raw material intentionally for the next phase of your life. Each day, a key. Each key, a question that goes straight to the core of what you have not yet resolved. Each question, a concrete micro-action so that transformation does not stay in the realm of ideas and does not dissolve into yet another insight without consequence. Over 60 days you read, perform the micro-action, and record your reflections, building, day after day, the direction that the previous years were preparing. The link is in the first pinned comment below this video. Read it now. If you have made it this far, something in you already knows it is time. Comment Desperto if you are ready to take this step. There is, however, one mistake that compromises everything that has been said so far. A mistake subtle enough that most people make it even after having intellectually understood what Jung was saying. The mistake of expecting life to give back exactly what was taken, in the same form, with the same face, with the same texture. You lost a relationship, and you keep waiting for the next person to fill the same space in the same way. You lost a professional path, and you keep waiting for an identical opportunity, in the same industry, with the same structure you had imagined, as if life should reimburse what was taken in an equivalent and precise manner. You lost years that you believed were your best, and you keep waiting for what comes next to be identical in intensity, in form, in promise, as if there were a department of cosmic restitution that analyzed your case and decided, yes, this one deserves to be compensated in the exact measure of what was removed. But life does not restore, life transforms. And the difference between these two operations is greater than it seems. To restore means to return to the original form. To transform means that the material goes through a process and emerges as something different, more complex, richer in structure and potential than it was before. A broken bone, when healed with proper care, becomes denser at the exact point of fracture than it was before breaking. It is not the same structure, it is a superior structure. But if you are looking at the bone expecting to find the original structure intact, you will call the healing a failure. You will feel that something is still wrong when, in fact, the tissue that formed is stronger than what existed before the impact. Jung worked with patients who could not accept recovery because recovery did not look like what they had lost. A woman who had lost a 20-year marriage could not recognize as real the love she found afterward, because the later love had a completely different texture, quieter, denser, less dramatic, and she had unconsciously equated dramatic intensity with real depth. What she called a lack of feeling was, in fact, an absence of anxiety. What she felt as emptiness was peace. She had mistaken calm for indifference because she had never known intimacy without turbulence. Healing was happening. She could not see it because she was looking for the old form of what had been wounded. A man who had lost nearly a decade of a promising career to a serious illness could not see the consulting business he built afterward as legitimate, because it was smaller in volume, because he served fewer clients, because the structure did not have the size he had planned for himself when he was young, and had not yet understood the real cost of certain speeds. What he could not see was that those years of illness, of fragility, of confronting his own limits had installed in him an understanding of human vulnerability, of what truly matters in a working relationship, of how to accompany someone in crisis with real presence, qualities that none of his competitors who had followed the linear path possessed. He was measuring volume. Life had delivered depth, and depth in the long run is what sustains. Many people do not perceive restoration because they are looking in the wrong place. They are waiting for the past to return with another face, and while they keep their eyes fixed on what was, what is passes by them unrecognized. Transformation does not announce itself. It does not arrive in the form you imagined when you made your plans. It arrives in the form you needed, not the one you had wished for. And recognizing that difference requires a specific kind of discernment that, ironically, only the years you called unproductive develop. The Code of Awakening was built to guide you precisely in that recognition, so that you stop looking for the old form of what was lost and begin to recognize the new form of what has been built. 60 days, one lesson per day, one concrete direction. The link is in the first pinned comment. Every day that passes without this recognition is a day in which transformation is already happening, but you still do not see it. Do not put it off. But before we move forward, there is something that needs to be said about what you yourself have hidden from yourself along the way, because here is the cruelest paradox of this entire process. Often, the greatest obstacle is not what life took from you. It is what you yourself buried. Jung dedicated a significant part of his work to what he called the shadow, not in the romantic, cinematic sense of something evil. The shadow, in the technical and precise sense, is simply everything you rejected in yourself in order to be accepted. It is the sum of all the parts you learned early in life were unwelcome. The anger you swallowed because anger scared the people you loved. The ambition you suppressed because ambition seemed like arrogance in the environment where you grew up. The creativity you abandoned because creativity wasn't an economic option. The boundaries you never set because setting boundaries meant risking the love of those around you. The spontaneity you sacrificed in exchange for approval. These parts do not disappear because you refused them. Buried things do not die. They change shape. They manifest as resentment with no clear object, as chronic exhaustion with no identifiable cause, as the persistent feeling that something is missing without your being able to name what. They show up in the envy you feel toward someone who does exactly what you once wanted to do and never allowed yourself. They show up in the disproportionate irritation you feel when someone occupies the space you never authorized yourself to occupy. They show up in the choices you make to please systems that were never designed for your specific flourishing. The practical translation of this is as follows. What bothers you most in others is with alarming frequency what you most lack in yourself. Not because the people around you are perfect, literal mirrors, but because the psyche uses the external to show what the internal is not allowed to express. The individual who completely suppressed assertiveness will feel deeply disturbed by assertive people, even when that assertiveness is completely legitimate and healthy. The individual who buried creativity will feel a strange mixture of admiration and hostility toward creative people, an admiration that quickly turns into rationalization like, yes, but they have conditions I didn't have. Yes, but they're different from me. Jung called this mechanism projection. You fall in love with or become enraged by the quality that the person represents, not the person themselves. You are, in fact, reacting to the reflection of something that exists in you and has not yet been recognized. The exhaustion you feel after socializing is not just physical fatigue. Often it is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself to keep others comfortable. It is the energetic cost of being who others need you to be instead of who you are. And this cost accumulates silently over decades until the system collapses in ways that conventional medicine cannot explain and that the person cannot attribute to any specific cause because the cause is not an event. It is a pattern. And here is where the years you call lost take on an entirely different meaning. What you accumulated in those years was not just pain, it was material. It was the accumulation of parts of yourself that were compressed, repressed, buried, but not destroyed. They are there, intact, waiting, the anger you never allowed to exist, the creativity that was never exercised, the direction you never followed because the social cost seemed too high, the talents that remained latent because the environment you were in had no room for them. Ayuskian individuation truly begins when you stop trying to fix the past and start reclaiming what was left behind. Not as an abstract therapeutic exercise, not as a process of self-flagellation or endless analysis, but as a concrete act of recovering real resources. The talent you abandoned, not because it didn't exist, but because there was no room for it. The curiosity you suffocated in order to fit into a box that was never made for you. The kind of life you wanted before you learned you weren't supposed to want it. There is a vitality sleeping inside you, not in some idealized future that depends on conditions that haven't yet been realized. Now, compressed beneath layers of social conformity, of others' expectations, of narratives about what is and isn't possible for someone in your specific situation. Jung said that we do not become whole by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The process is not one of addition. It's not about adding more techniques, more habits, more content. It is one of recovery. You don't need to become someone else. You need to reclaim who you already were before you learned you couldn't be. And the years you spent trying to fit where you didn't belong, trying to please systems that were never designed for your flourishing, those years were not wasted. They were the cost of the most necessary lesson, knowing with clinical precision what you are not. And knowing what you are not is half the journey toward discovering what you truly are. Not as a philosophical concept, as an operational starting point for the next years of your life. The central problem, therefore, is not the time that has passed. It is the belief that you were falling behind while that time was passing. And that belief, that specific belief about being late, about closed windows, about the best that has already been, needs to be examined with the same coldness with which a surgeon examines tissue before cutting. Because it is not true. It never was. It is a construct, and constructs can be deconstructed. There is something that contemporary psychology, with all its efficiency and protocols, struggles to admit, but which any serious clinical analyst observes repeatedly and consistently in their practice. Each person has a biological, psychic, and circumstantial time to flourish, and that time is not negotiable. It cannot be accelerated by willpower or discipline. It is not comparable to the time of anyone you know, follow, or admire. The Moso bamboo does not grow visibly during the first 4 years. You water it, fertilize it, care for it, and nothing happens on the surface that you can see or measure. Then, in the 5th year, the bamboo grows over 70 feet in a few weeks. The question that matters is, was the bamboo idle during those first 4 years? No. It was building a root system so dense and so extensive that it will sustain decades of later growth. The growth that came later was only possible because of the years that to the naked eye seemed completely unproductive. The impatient observer who dug up the plant in the 3rd year because he saw no result made the most fundamental mistake. He confused invisibility with absence. Clinical psychology offers analogous human examples with a regularity that cannot be ignored. People who lived for decades with the feeling of missing the mark, of not fitting into any of the available spaces, of being on a path that wasn't theirs, and who only in middle age or after it found the field of activity where all the previous years suddenly made sense as preparation, not as delay, as specific preparation for something that, without those years, would not have the same solidity. José Saramago, one of the greatest writers in the Portuguese language of all time, published his first major novel when he was over 40. He was not a writer who had arrived late by any universal deadline. He was a writer who needed exactly those years, of manual labor, of observation, of a life lived in layers that youth cannot reach, in order to have something to say worth reading. Charles Darwin formulated the theory of evolution after decades of meticulous observation, of doubts, of discarded and revisited drafts. He was not behind schedule. He was in the exact rhythm of the process of discovery that a theory of that magnitude demanded. But these examples, though illuminating, are not the most relevant for you. The most relevant is your specific case, your particular story, your specific years, the specific question of why you arrived at this moment, with this video on the screen, with these questions still open. Instead of having arrived at this understanding 10 years ago, or never having arrived at all. Jung believed that psychic life does not operate by chance. What appears to be coincidence is often necessity that has not yet been named. You are not here now because life was generous or because luck favored you. You are here because something internal, some sufficiently mature process, built during the years that seemed dead, brought you to a point where you are finally able to hear what you needed to hear. The capacity to receive this information was not the same 5 years ago. The years changed something in your internal structure that only now allows this level of conversation to take place. What lies before you no longer demands more time for preparation. It demands direction. The material is built. What is missing is the map to use it intentionally. The Código do Despertar is in the first pinned comment below this video. 60 days of daily lessons based on Jungian psychology, not to transform you into someone you are not, to return you to what you already are, but that became buried under layers of adjustment and survival. Each lesson is a key that opens a door you locked out of necessity at some point in your life, and that can now be opened with awareness, without the cost it would have had if you had forced it earlier. You read, perform the micro-action, record the reflection. 60 days. What was built in you during all those years begins to take direction. The link is in the first comment. Read it now. The time for preparation is over. What begins now is different. But there is one last barrier, and it is the most insidious of all, because it does not appear as fear. It does not appear as declared resistance. It does not appear as laziness. It appears with the most deceptive face possible. It appears as legitimate reasoning. That barrier is comparison. We are not talking about the obvious, superficial, easy-to-identify comparison, visible envy, open and declared competition. We are talking about structural comparison, the one embedded in the questions you ask yourself in an apparently innocent way. Why haven't I gotten there yet? Why did they succeed before me? What did I do wrong that others did right? At what point did my clock slow down while theirs kept pace? These questions seem legitimate. They seem like honest reflection. They seem like the kind of rational analysis that an intelligent and responsible person makes about their own life. But they are high-precision traps because they presuppose that there is a universal there that everyone should reach, a single standardized route, a standard time toward which everyone should converge. And that presupposition, this social fiction built progressively by systems that need people to be comparable so that they can be classified, hierarchized, and mobilized, is completely false. Jung never used one patient's process as a yardstick for another's, because individuation is a radically particular process. What means flourishing for one specific individual may be imprisonment for another. What looks like stagnation in one life is incubation in another. What looks like success from the outside can be the most sophisticated form of self-annihilation on the inside. The universal ruler does not exist. You borrowed it from a system that does not know you, that never knew you, and that was never built with your specific flourishing as its goal. Social comparison does not only generate anxiety, it operates a deeper and more costly distortion. It makes you invest energy in proving that you are competing, instead of investing energy in discovering what you genuinely are and what you genuinely came to build. It is the difference between living not to lose and living to fulfill, and these two modes of operation produce completely different lives, even when the external results are superficially similar. The individual who accumulated wealth to prove he is no less than so-and-so, and the individual who accumulated wealth as a byproduct of doing what was genuinely his own. These two individuals may have equal bank balances and internal experiences that share no point of common ground. You have already been through the years when comparison was an unconscious driver of decisions. How many choices did you make, not because they wanted to be made, but because you needed to prove something, to someone, to a system, to a version of yourself that accepted another's ruler as the only ruler that existed? How many times did you feel behind in relation to a deadline that no one, at no point in your life, had actually agreed upon with you? The deadline did not exist. The ruler is not yours. And the judgment you made of your own life using these instruments produced exactly what any calculation made with the wrong instruments produces, a result that does not correspond to reality. The years you called lost were not lost. They were lived under a logic that was not yours, under a ruler you borrowed without noticing and never returned. And the difference between this sentence and a cheap motivational message is that I am not telling you that life begins now and that everything will be fine. I am telling you that the logic that produced suffering has just been named. And things that are named lose the power they had when they were invisible and operated in the darkness of consciousness. The feeling of being behind is not an objective fact about your life. It is the result of a calculation made with the wrong ruler, applied to a clock that was never yours. When you remove this comparison, genuinely remove it, not as a self-help exercise, but as an act of intellectual refusal of a demonstrably false premise. What remains is not emptiness. It is clarity, the clarity that you are where you are, not where others are, not where you imagined you would be, where you are. And this place, exactly this one, with all its specific and unrepeatable history, is the real starting point for what comes next. Jung spent his entire life documenting that the central problem of the modern psyche is the alienation of the individual from himself. The gradual, almost imperceptible surrender of inner authority to external systems, religious, social, cultural, economic systems, that promise meaning and deliver conformity, that promise belonging and deliver invisibility, that promise security and deliver a cost that only appears decades later, when the person looks back and realizes that they spent their entire life being exactly what everyone expected them to be, and no longer knows how to distinguish what they wanted from what they learned to want. The return to yourself is not a romanticized path of self-discovery. It is not a journey to the mountains. It is not a spiritual retreat. It is a precise, methodical, often uncomfortable labor of reclaiming authority over the meaning of your own existence, of recognizing that the ruler you used to measure your years was not yours, that the deadlines you missed were not your deadlines, that the person you believed was not good enough was being judged by criteria that should never have been yours. No one follows the same clock, not because this is a beautiful metaphor to soothe your anxiety, but because it is an accurate description of how the human psyche operates when seen without the distortions that collective thought imposes upon it. The years that were yours, all of them, including those you cannot look at without feeling their weight, were exactly the years necessary to build who you are at this moment, not an inferior version of what you could have been. You, whole. With all the marks, with all the fractures that became denser at the point of impact, with all the understanding that exists only because it was bought at exactly the cost you paid. The illusion that there is a parallel, superior version of you, the one that didn't make the mistakes, that didn't waste time, that arrived earlier, that made the right choices at the right moment, that illusion is the only real obstacle between you and what is possible from now on. Because as long as you are mourning a life that didn't happen, you cannot fully invest in the one that is happening. And the life that is happening, this one now with everything it has and everything it hasn't yet shown, is the only one that exists. It is the only one over which you have any real authority. You can close this video and continue carrying the ruler that no one asked you to carry. Continue calculating what didn't happen based on a timeline that wasn't made for you. Continue investing energy in proving that you are not late to an audience that most of the time is too busy with its own ruler to observe you with the attention you imagine. Continue waiting for life to restore exactly what was taken in the exact form it was, while real transformation passes you by, unrecognized. Or you can do what Jung spent decades describing as the only real path to a life that is not a copy of the life others expected you to live. Reclaim authority over the meaning of what you lived. Recognize what was built in you without your conscious knowledge and use that material, now with the awareness that only those years could forge, to build what only you can build. The Code of Awakening is in the first pinned comment. The illusion is over. The years were not lost. What you do with this truth now is the only decision that matters.